The vengeful spirit of a young woman's betrayal. Summary. Kiara, a young woman sent to the city by her poor parents for university, endures relentless abuse from her aunt, Lila, and cousin, Clara. Treated like a servant, she cooks, cleans, and suffers constant humiliation. Despite her hardships, Kiara remains focused on her studies, determined not to let her family's sacrifices go to waste. One stormy night, after escalating cruelty and an unsettling encounter with her uncle, Donovan, Kiara is found dead in her room. Panicked, the family buries her in the backyard, hoping to conceal their crime. However, Kiara's spirit does not rest. Supernatural events soon plague the family. Shadows stretch unnaturally, reflections twist grotesquely, and eerie sounds fill the house. Each torment mirrors the abuse Kiara suffered. Lila and Clara's cruelty is exposed, and Donovan is forced to confront his guilt in a chilling, vengeful climax. By the end, Kiara's ghost achieves justice, but her tormentors face haunting consequences. Clara is left broken, the house abandoned and whispered about as cursed. The story serves as a chilling reminder of the cost of unchecked cruelty and the haunting power of a restless spirit seeking retribution. Part 1. The silent struggle. The city was alive at dawn, buzzing with the hum of traffic and the chatter of early risers. Yet, within the walls of a modest, aging house on a quiet street, a different kind of life stirred. Kiara awoke in darkness, the faint glow of her phone, the only light in her cramped room. Her alarm had gone off hours earlier, and the heavy wooden door that separated her from the rest of the house seemed to weigh down on her like a tangible burden. Kiara's day began long before the sun rose. She moved silently, her bare feet brushing against the cold tiles as she tiptoed to the kitchen. Her aunt, Lila, was an early riser too, though not to share Kiara's burdens. Instead, Lila's sharp voice would echo through the house, barking orders and complaints that carved into Kiara's already fragile self-esteem. "Why is breakfast not ready yet? Do you think this house runs on your lazy whims?" Lila's voice sliced through the morning air as Kiara scrambled to prepare the food. Her hands trembled slightly as she stirred the porridge, her eyes darting toward the clock. She had to finish everything before Clara, her cousin, woke up. Clara's temper was just as sharp as her mother's, if not worse. Clara, spoiled and vindictive, reveled in making Kiara's life miserable. At 21, Clara was everything Kiara was not: confident, brash, and entitled. While Kiara's days were spent balancing the weight of household chores and her university studies, Clara lounged around, treating Kiara as nothing more than a personal maid. Kiara's only solace came from the faint hope that her sacrifices were not in vain. Back home, her parents, worn by years of hard labor, had scraped together their meager savings to send her to the city. "Study hard," Kiara, her mother, had whispered through tears the day she left. "Make us proud." That memory sustained her. But each day in Lila's house chipped away at Kiara's spirit. The constant ridicule and isolation weighed heavily on her, turning her life into a silent struggle she bore alone. One morning, Clara descended the stairs, her face set in a scowl. "Why is the toast burnt?" she snapped, shoving the plate away. The toast tumbled to the floor, but Kiara remained silent, kneeling to pick it up. Her chest tightened, her hands shaking, but she didn't dare look up. "Are you deaf?" Clara sneered. "I said I won't eat this garbage." She kicked at the crumbs, scattering them further. Kiara swallowed hard, her voice a whisper. "I'll make more." The day continued in the same rhythm. Lila's sharp words, Clara's cruel taunts, and Kiara's silent compliance filled the hours. Evenings offered no reprieve as the family gathered in the living room. Kiara was tasked with serving tea and tidying up, ignored as if she were invisible. Late at night, when the house was finally quiet, Kiara would retreat to her tiny room. Her textbooks were her only companions, their pages offering a brief escape from her reality. She studied until her eyes burned, willing herself to push through the exhaustion. But even in those stolen moments, fear lingered: fear of failing her parents, fear of facing another day. Kiara's mind often wandered to her family. She pictured her mother's calloused hands, her father's weathered face, and the warmth of their small home. She yearned for the embrace of familiarity, for a place where she wasn't treated as an outsider. But those thoughts only deepened her resolve. She couldn't let them down, not after everything they'd done for her. One evening, as she scrubbed the kitchen floor, a sharp pain shot through her hand. She winced, glancing down to see a deep cut from a piece of broken glass. Blood welled up, staining the soapy water red. She instinctively pressed a cloth to the wound, biting her lip to stifle a cry. As she wrapped her hand in a makeshift bandage, Lila appeared in the doorway. "What's taking you so long?" Lila snapped, her eyes narrowing. "Do you think you can slack off just because you're hurt?" Kiara bowed her head. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'll finish quickly." Lila huffed and walked away, muttering under her breath. Kiara's chest tightened as she fought back tears. She wanted to scream, to demand some semblance of kindness, but she knew better. In this house, her pain didn't matter. The silent struggle continued, day after day. Kiara's resilience was remarkable, but even the strongest spirits have limits. Each unkind word, each act of cruelty, pushed her closer to the edge. Yet she held on, her hope a flickering flame in the darkness. She told herself she could endure it. She had to. For her family, for her future. But the shadows in the house seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. And as Kiara's quiet suffering went unnoticed, something unseen began to stir. A force born from pain and despair lingered in the corners waiting. The house, once merely a prison, was becoming something far more sinister, expanding the depth of Kiara's struggle. The days blurred into one another, marked only by the endless repetition of tasks and the sting of cruel words. Kiara had long since given up any thought of fairness or respite. Her existence in Lila's home was defined by survival. Each morning began with a ritual: her silent prayers for strength, her hurried movements to avoid waking the household too soon, and her whispered reassurances to herself that today would be better. But it rarely was. Lila seemed to take perverse pleasure in finding fault with everything Kiara did. "You're hopeless," she would say, throwing her hands up in exasperation. "How do you expect to succeed if you can't even make a proper cup of tea?" Clara's attacks were more personal. She mocked Kiara's appearance, her modest clothes, her quiet demeanor. "You're like a ghost," Clara once said with a cruel laugh. "No wonder no one likes you." Kiara's cheeks flushed, but she said nothing. She had learned long ago that arguing only made things worse. Instead, she focused on her studies, pouring all her energy into her dream of a better future. Her professors praised her dedication, but even their kind words couldn't erase the sting of her daily life. Then there were the nights. The silence of the house was oppressive, broken only by the creaks and groans of the old wood and the faint rustle of the wind. Kiara often lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with worries. Would she ever escape this life? Would her parents' sacrifices be worth it? It was during these sleepless nights that Kiara began to notice things. Shadows that seemed to move on their own. Faint whispers that had no source. A chilling sensation that crept over her when she was alone. At first, she dismissed it as exhaustion or her imagination playing tricks. But as the weeks passed, the occurrences became harder to ignore. One night, as she sat at her small desk, her lamp flickered and went out. The darkness enveloped her like a suffocating shroud. She reached for her phone, but before she could turn on the flashlight, she felt a cold breath against her neck. Her heart raced as she spun around, but there was no one there. Only the faint sound of footsteps retreating down the hall. Kiara's hands trembled as she clutched her phone. Her first instinct was to run, but where would she go? The thought of waking Lila or Clara was even more terrifying. She took a deep breath and forced herself to turn the lamp back on. The room was empty, but the air felt heavy, as if it was watching her. As the days turned into weeks, the house's oppressive atmosphere seemed to grow stronger. Kiara's silent struggle continued, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was no longer alone in her suffering. Something was there, lurking in the shadows, waiting, and it was only just beginning. Part 2. Clara's cruelty. Kiara's world was a delicate balancing act, teetering on the edge of endurance. Yet, if there was one force that tipped it closer to collapse, it was Clara's unrelenting cruelty. Clara, spoiled and unkind, thrived on belittling Kiara at every opportunity. Each word, each action felt like another stone placed on Kiara's back. One crisp morning, sunlight filtered through the curtains as Kiara set the dining table. The plates were pristine, the food neatly arranged. She had been up for hours preparing breakfast, her fingers still sore from scrubbing the kitchen the night before. Yet, when Clara sauntered into the room, her face twisted in disdain. "What is this?" Clara demanded, picking up a slice of toast. Before Kiara could answer, Clara's voice rose. "It's burnt. Are you trying to poison me?" Kiara's cheeks flushed. I'll make another batch," she stammered, reaching for the plate. But Clara's response was swift and cruel. She threw the toast onto the floor, scattering crumbs across the tiles. "Don't bother," Clara sneered. "You'll probably ruin that too." Her sharp laughter echoed as she turned away, leaving Kiara kneeling on the floor to pick up the mess. The humiliation burned, but Kiara bit her lip, her fingers trembling as she swept the crumbs into her palm. The incident was not isolated. Clara's spite was a constant presence, a shadow that loomed over Kiara's every action. If Kiara cleaned, Clara would point out a missed spot. If she cooked, Clara would complain about the taste. Her insults ranged from mocking Kiara's appearance to degrading her intelligence. "You're pathetic," Clara said one afternoon, lounging on the sofa. "Do you even have friends at that school of yours? Or are they all just as boring as you?" Kiara's hands tightened around the laundry basket she carried. She wanted to shout, to defend herself, but the words stuck in her throat. She knew better than to argue. Instead, she simply nodded and walked away, her chest heavy with unspoken pain. But Clara's cruelty wasn't limited to words. One particularly harrowing evening, Kiara had just finished mopping the floor when Clara barged into the room. Her shoes, muddy from the rain, left dark streaks across the tiles. Kiara froze, her exhaustion forgotten in the face of Clara's disregard. "I just cleaned that," Kiara said softly, unable to keep the frustration out of her voice. Clara's eyes narrowed. "Are you talking back to me?" she snapped. Before Kiara could respond, Clara grabbed the mop and tossed it aside, the handle clattering loudly against the wall. "Clean it again." Properly this time. Kiara's shoulders sagged as she bent to pick up the mop. Her tears mixed with the soapy water as she worked, scrubbing the floor once more. But she didn't cry because of the task. She cried because, deep down, she feared this was her life now, a cycle of humiliation and servitude, with no end in sight. Her only respite was the thought of her parents back home. Each night, as she lay on her thin mattress, she whispered silent promises to them. "I'll make you proud," she told herself. "This is temporary. I can survive this." But as Clara's cruelty grew more inventive, Kiara began to doubt her own words. One particularly bitter morning, Clara escalated her taunts to an unbearable degree. "I found this dress in your room," Clara announced, holding up a worn but cherished garment. "It's hideous. Where did you even get it?" A dumpster. Kiara's heart sank. That dress had been a gift from her mother, a rare indulgence bought with hard-earned savings. "Please put it back," Kiara said, her voice trembling. "Why?" "You're not going anywhere fancy," Clara sneered. With a malicious grin, she dropped the dress into a bucket of dirty water. Oops, something inside Kiara broke. She rushed forward, pulling the soaked fabric from the bucket, her hands clutching it tightly as tears streamed down her face. Clara watched her with a smug expression, satisfied with her victory. For Kiara, the humiliation was too much. That night, as she sat in her room, clutching the ruined dress, she allowed herself to cry freely. The weight of Clara's cruelty, combined with her own feelings of helplessness, became an unbearable burden. Yet even in her despair, a small flame of resolve burned within her. "I have to endure this," she whispered to herself. "For them. For my parents. I can't give up." But the house, as if feeding off her despair, seemed to darken with each passing day. Shadows grew longer, corners colder, and in the silence of the night, Kiara began to feel as though she wasn't alone. Something unseen, something vengeful, was stirring in the depths of her suffering. A growing malice. The days stretched into weeks, each one more grueling than the last. Clara's malicious antics began taking on a sharper edge, almost as if she enjoyed testing Kiara's breaking point. One evening, Kiara returned from her university classes only to find her books scattered across the floor, their pages torn and smeared with ink. "Clara, why did you do this?" Kiara's voice cracked as she knelt to pick up the ruined pages. Clara smirked from the couch, her legs lazily draped over the armrest. "Maybe I thought you needed a break from all that studying. It's not like you'll get anywhere with it anyway." Kiara's chest tightened, her hands shaking as she gathered the books. She wanted to lash out, to demand an answer for such cruelty. But Clara's smug expression only deepened her sense of helplessness. The words of her professors about her potential felt hollow in the face of this relentless torment. One particularly cold night, Kiara awoke to a loud crash from the kitchen. Heart pounding, she crept downstairs, expecting another of Clara's antics. Instead, she found the dining chairs toppled, the air thick with an unplaceable unease. A chill ran down her spine as she turned to see Clara standing in the doorway, her face pale. "Did you hear that?" Clara's voice was uncharacteristically small. Kiara frowned. "You didn't do this." Clara shook her head, her bravado seemingly drained. For the first time, Kiara saw a flicker of fear in her cousin's eyes. But the moment passed as quickly as it came. Clara's sneer returned, and she pushed past Kiara. "Must have been the wind." "Clean it up." Kiara's gaze lingered on the overturned chairs, her unease growing. Something felt different, heavier, as if the house itself was shifting. And as she bent to fix the chaos, she couldn't shake the feeling that unseen eyes were watching her every move. The first manifestations. The atmosphere in the house grew more oppressive with each passing day. Doors creaked open without cause and faint whispers echoed through empty halls. At first, Kiara chalked it up to her frayed nerves and lack of sleep. But when objects began to move on their own, a chair sliding across the floor, a book falling from a shelf, she knew something was terribly wrong. Clara remained oblivious, brushing off the odd occurrences with dismissive laughter. But Kiara noticed her cousin's confident exterior beginning to crack. Clara's nights grew restless. Kiara often heard her muttering in her sleep, her voice tinged with fear. One night, as Kiara prepared to sleep, the light bulb in her room flickered and went out. Darkness enveloped her, and with it came an icy breeze that shouldn't have been possible in the stagnant summer air. She froze, her breath shallow, as the faint sound of a woman's sobs filled the room. "Who's there?" Kiara whispered, her voice trembling. The sobs stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence that made her skin crawl. Kiara spent the rest of the night sitting upright, her heart racing, as the darkness pressed in around her. Whatever was happening in the house, it wasn't just her imagination. Something malevolent was awakening, feeding on the cruelty and despair that filled the air. And Kiara had the sinking feeling that it was just getting started. Part 3. Uncle Donovan's sinister intentions. As night fell on the house, a heavy silence enveloped the air. Kiara sat at her small desk, scribbling notes for her classes, the faint glow of her lamp providing the only light in the room. She tried to focus, but the atmosphere of the house felt different, darker, as if the walls themselves were closing in. For weeks, subtle changes had crept into her life, but tonight, something more tangible lingered in the shadows. Uncle Donovan's behavior had always been odd, but recently it had taken on an unsettling edge. His gaze lingered on Kiara too long, his casual comments too loaded with underlying tension. He had always been an aloof figure in the house, but now, his presence felt predatory, and Kiara couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching her when she wasn't looking. One evening, as Kiara finished her chores, Donovan approached her in the dimly lit hallway. "Still working hard?" His voice was low, almost a whisper, as he leaned against the wall. The way his eyes scanned her made Kiara's stomach churn. "Yes, Uncle," she replied softly, avoiding his gaze and clutching the dishcloth in her hands like a lifeline. He chuckled, a sound that felt more menacing than amused. "You're such a good girl, always so obedient." The words lingered in the air, thick with implication. Kiara excused herself quickly, retreating to her room and locking the door behind her. She sat on her bed, her heart pounding. For the first time, she truly felt unsafe. She wrapped her arms around herself, whispering silent prayers for strength. The following days brought no respite. Donovan's behavior grew bolder, his presence more invasive. He would find excuses to be near her, brushing past her in the narrow hallways or lingering too long in the kitchen while she worked. His sly comments made her skin crawl, but she had no one to turn to. Lila was dismissive at best and hostile at worst, and Clara was too preoccupied with her own malice to care. One night, Kiara's fears came to a head. She had just finished cleaning the dining room and was heading upstairs when she noticed Donovan sitting alone in the darkened living room. He was nursing a glass of whiskey, the amber liquid catching the faint light of the street lamp outside. "Kiara," he called out as she passed, his voice slurred but deliberate. She froze, her hand gripping the banister. "Yes, Uncle," she replied, forcing her voice to remain steady. "Come here," he said, motioning to the seat across from him. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but she obeyed, sitting on the edge of the chair as far from him as possible. "You work so hard around here," he began, his words slow and deliberate. "But do they appreciate you? Does anyone really notice?" Kiara's fingers gripped the edge of the chair. I do my best," she murmured. He leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "You deserve better, Kiara. Someone should take care of you for once." His hand reached out, but she sprang to her feet before he could touch her. "I should go to bed." "I have an early class," she said quickly, backing toward the stairs. Donovan's expression darkened, but he didn't stop her. "Good night, Kiara," he said, his voice dripping with unspoken threats. Once in her room, Kiara locked the door and shoved her desk chair beneath the knob for extra security. She sank to the floor, her body trembling. She couldn't deny it anymore. She wasn't just uncomfortable in this house, she was in danger. The escalation of fear. The tension in the house thickened like a storm cloud. Donovan's presence became oppressive, his actions more brazen. One afternoon, Kiara was cleaning the upstairs hallway when she felt his eyes on her. Turning, she saw him standing at the end of the corridor, watching her with a chilling intensity. "Need help?" he asked, a smirk playing on his lips. "No, thank you," she replied quickly, keeping her head down and moving to another room. But even behind closed doors, she could feel his gaze lingering, as if it had seeped through the walls. That night, Kiara heard footsteps outside her room. They were slow, deliberate, and stopped just outside her door. She held her breath, listening as the doorknob rattled softly. Her heart pounded as she clutched her blanket, praying he would go away. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps retreated, but sleep eluded her for the rest of the night. Donovan's actions weren't the only things unsettling Kiara. The house itself seemed to echo her fear. Shadows moved where there was no light, and faint whispers filled the air when no one else was around. Kiara began to feel as if the house was alive, feeding on her terror and despair. One evening, as Kiara prepared dinner, she dropped a knife. It clattered loudly against the floor, and Donovan appeared almost instantly, his presence looming in the doorway. "Careful," he said, his tone dripping with mock concern. "You wouldn't want to hurt yourself." Kiara forced a smile, picking up the knife and continuing her work. But she could feel his eyes on her the entire time, like a predator watching its prey. The breaking point. The breaking point came late one night. Kiara was studying in her room when she heard a faint knock at her door. Her blood ran cold as Donovan's voice followed. "Kiara, are you awake?" She didn't answer, her breath hitching as she stared at the door. The knock came again, louder this time. "I just want to talk," he said, his tone eerily calm. Kiara didn't move, her body frozen with fear. After a few moments, the knocking stopped. But she didn't dare relax. She spent the rest of the night huddled in the corner of her room, her eyes fixed on the door. By morning, she knew she couldn't stay in the house much longer. Donovan's intentions were clear, and she couldn't rely on Lila or Clara to protect her. But as she planned her escape, the house seemed to close in around her, its malevolence growing stronger. She wasn't just fighting Donovan, she was fighting the house itself, and she had no idea which was more dangerous. Kiara's silent struggle had transformed into a desperate battle for survival. The house that had once been her prison was now her predator, and the shadows within it threatened to consume her entirely. Part 4. The tragic night. The storm rolled in without warning, thunder rumbling like an ominous drumbeat as rain lashed against the windows of the house. Inside, the tension had reached a breaking point. Kiara stood in the kitchen, her hands trembling as she washed the last of the dinner dishes. The clatter of plates and the muffled voices from the living room were the only sounds cutting through the storm's fury. Dinner had been a disaster. Clara had mocked Kiara mercilessly, making cruel remarks about her cooking, her appearance, and her very existence. Lila had joined in, as always, her sharp words landing like daggers. Donovan, silent and brooding, had sat at the head of the table, his presence more unsettling than the storm raging outside. "You're useless," Clara had sneered, pushing her plate away. "Why do we even keep you around?" Kiara had swallowed her tears, her heart pounding as she excused herself to the kitchen. She couldn't take it anymore. The walls of the house felt like they were closing in, suffocating her. But there was no escape, not tonight. As she finished her chores, a loud crash from the living room made her jump. She rushed to see what had happened, finding a shattered vase on the floor and Clara standing over it, her face twisted with anger. "Look what you made me do," Clara shouted, pointing at Kiara, as if she were to blame. "I wasn't even here," Kiara said quietly, her voice trembling. "Don't you talk back to me," Clara snapped, stepping closer. "You're just a parasite, living off of us and ruining everything." Before Kiara could respond, Lila entered the room, her expression cold. "What's going on?" she demanded. "She's being disrespectful again," Clara said, her voice dripping with venom. Lila turned to Kiara, her eyes narrowing. "Clean this up," she ordered, gesturing to the broken vase. Kiara nodded, her hands shaking as she crouched to pick up the shards. The sharp edges bit into her fingers, drawing blood, but she didn't dare stop. Behind her, she could feel Donovan's gaze, heavy and oppressive. Enough. Donovan's voice cut through the room, startling everyone. "Let her finish and go to her room." Lila and Clara exchanged a glance but said nothing, retreating to the sofa. Kiara quickly cleaned up the mess and fled upstairs, her heart racing. The final confrontation. In her room, Kiara locked the door and sank onto her bed. The sound of the storm outside mirrored the turmoil inside her. She hugged her knees to her chest, tears streaming down her face. She couldn't live like this anymore. She had to get out. But how? Suddenly, a loud banging on her door made her jump. "Kiara, open up." Donovan's voice was slurred, the unmistakable edge of anger in his tone. "Go away," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The banging grew louder. "Don't make me come in there," he shouted. Panic surged through Kiara. She scrambled to block the door with her desk, her hands trembling as she pushed it into place. The door rattled violently as Donovan pounded on it, his voice growing more menacing. "Kiara, open this door now." Her heart raced as she backed into the corner of the room, clutching her phone. She considered calling the police, but the thought of Lila and Clara's reaction stopped her. They would never forgive her for bringing shame to the family. She was trapped. The pounding stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Kiara held her breath, straining to hear any movement. After a few moments, she heard heavy footsteps retreating down the hall. She let out a shaky breath, her body trembling with fear. The morning after, when the storm finally subsided, the house was deathly quiet. Kiara didn't dare leave her room until the first light of dawn filtered through her window. She crept downstairs, hoping to avoid Donovan, but the scene that greeted her froze her in place. Lila and Clara stood in the kitchen, their faces pale and strained. Donovan was slumped in a chair, his head in his hands. The air was thick with tension, and Kiara immediately sensed that something was very wrong. "What happened?" she asked hesitantly. Lila's eyes snapped to her, filled with anger and fear. "You happened," she spat. Before Kiara could respond, Donovan stood up, his face contorted with rage. "You think you can just cause trouble in this house and get away with it?" He growled. "I didn't do anything," Kiara protested, her voice shaking. "Enough," Lila shouted. "We're not dealing with this anymore." What happened next was a blur. Kiara's pleas fell on deaf ears as the family's anger boiled over. She tried to defend herself, but the words were drowned out by accusations and threats. The last thing she remembered was Donovan's hand striking her face, sending her sprawling to the floor. The grim aftermath. When Kiara woke, she was in her room, her body aching and her mind foggy. But something was wrong. The air was cold, unnaturally so, and the house was eerily silent. She tried to move but found herself too weak. Darkness crept in at the edges of her vision, and she felt a strange, heavy presence pressing down on her. Hours later, Lila and Donovan stood in the backyard, the rain-soaked earth clinging to their shoes. They worked in grim silence, digging a shallow grave beneath the cover of darkness. Clara stood nearby, her arms crossed and her expression unreadable. "We had no choice," Lila muttered, her voice shaking. Donovan didn't respond, his jaw set as he shoveled the last of the dirt over Kiara's lifeless body. As they finished, the storm began to clear, the moon casting an eerie glow over the freshly turned soil. The family retreated to the house, their faces pale and haunted. But the house, once a silent witness to their cruelty, seemed to hum with a new energy. Something had changed, and the family's actions would not go unanswered. The tragic night had come to an end, but it was only the beginning of something far more terrifying. Part 5. The first signs. The days following Kiara's death were eerily quiet. The house, once filled with Clara's sharp laughter and Lila's cutting remarks, now seemed steeped in an oppressive silence. Shadows lingered longer in the corners, and the air felt heavy, as though the house itself bore the weight of an unspoken truth. Lila, Donovan, and Clara avoided speaking of the night they buried Kiara. Yet, despite their denial, something lingered, something they could not escape. Unsettling phenomena. It began subtly. Clara was the first to notice. One morning, as she stood in front of the bathroom mirror brushing her hair, she caught a flicker of movement in her reflection. At first, she dismissed it as a trick of the light, but when she looked closer, she froze. Her reflection was smiling at her. A cold, unnatural grin that did not match her own expression. She stumbled back, knocking over a bottle of perfume. When she glanced at the mirror again, the smile was gone, replaced by her own terrified face. Clara's breath came in shallow gasps as she fled the bathroom, refusing to speak of what she had seen. The next day, Donovan experienced his own encounter. He was alone in the living room, nursing a glass of whiskey. The room was dimly lit, the only light coming from the flickering television. As he reached for the remote, he felt a cold breeze brush against the back of his neck. He turned sharply, but no one was there. A faint sobbing echoed through the room, so soft it could have been mistaken for the wind. But Donovan knew better. His hands trembled as he downed the rest of his drink and retreated upstairs, locking his bedroom door behind him. The house awakens. The phenomena grew more frequent, and each occurrence more disturbing than the last. Doors creaked open on their own, despite being locked. Lights flickered and went out, plunging the house into moments of complete darkness. Objects moved inexplicably, a chair sliding across the floor, a book falling from a shelf without reason. One night, as Lila prepared to go to bed, she found her bedroom window wide open. Rain poured in, soaking the carpet and curtains. She distinctly remembered closing it earlier. Muttering curses under her breath, she moved to shut it, but as she reached out, a shadow passed by outside. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but it sent a chill down her spine. "Clara," she called out, her voice shaking. When no answer came, she slammed the window shut and locked it, her heart racing. That night, sleep eluded her. Clara's torment. Clara's torment escalated. One evening, she sat at her vanity, applying makeup. The mirror reflected the room behind her, and for a moment she thought she saw a figure standing in the doorway. She turned quickly, but no one was there. When she looked back at the mirror, her reflection was gone entirely. The empty glass stared back at her, mocking her. Clara screamed, the sound echoing through the house. Lila and Donovan rushed to her room, finding her huddled on the floor, trembling. "There's something in this house," Clara whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "It's her." "I know it's her." Lila slapped her hard across the face. "Get a hold of yourself," she hissed. "We agreed not to talk about it." You're imagining things. But Clara couldn't be consoled. She refused to sleep in her room that night, instead huddling on the couch in the living room. Yet even there, she felt the oppressive weight of unseen eyes watching her. Donovan's descent. Donovan, too, was unraveling. One evening, he sat alone in his study, the room filled with the scent of old books and whiskey. He flipped through a newspaper, but the words blurred before his eyes. A low whisper broke the silence, faint but unmistakable. Donovan, he froze, his blood turning to ice. The whisper came again, this time closer. He spun around, his chair creaking beneath him, but the room was empty. As he turned back to the desk, his glass of whiskey slid across the surface and shattered on the floor. He stood abruptly, his chest heaving, and fled the study, leaving the broken glass behind. The manifestation. The house's malevolence reached its peak one stormy night. The family was gathered in the living room, the storm outside mirroring their inner turmoil. Thunder boomed, and the lights flickered ominously. The television turned on by itself, static crackling across the screen. "Turn it off," Leela snapped, her voice trembling. Donovan grabbed the remote, but the buttons didn't respond. The static grew louder, almost deafening, and then the image on the screen shifted. It showed the backyard, rain pouring down on the freshly turned soil of Kiara's grave. The camera panned closer and closer, until it was focused on a pale hand reaching out from the dirt. Clara screamed, and the television went dark. The family sat frozen, their breaths shallow and rapid. Then, from the hallway, they heard its soft, deliberate footsteps. They turned toward the sound, but the hallway was empty. A single sob echoed through the house, sending chills down their spines. The family huddled together, their fear palpable. The house was no longer theirs. It belonged to her, to Kiara. Her presence was undeniable, her spirit relentless in its quest for justice. The first signs had become impossible to ignore, and the family knew they were only the beginning of what was to come. Part 6. Supernatural Retribution. The house had become a battlefield of guilt and terror. Kiara's restless spirit was no longer content to haunt the edges of the family's lives. She was now their relentless judge and executioner, targeting each of her tormentors with precision and ferocity. The air within the house grew colder, heavier, carrying with it the weight of justice that Kiara demanded. Whispers of cruelty. Lila was the first to feel the full force of Kiara's wrath. It began subtly, with whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. While standing alone in the kitchen one evening, she heard her name being called in a faint, accusatory tone. Lila, she froze, her hand gripping the counter. The voice was soft but filled with anguish. It was Kiara's voice, unmistakable. "You let it happen." Lila spun around, but the room was empty. Her heart pounded as she tried to rationalize the experience. "I'm just tired," she muttered, shaking her head. But the whispers persisted, growing louder and more insistent with each passing day. At night, as she lay in bed, Lila would hear Kiara's voice echoing in her ears. "You were supposed to protect me." The guilt that she had buried deep within herself began to surface, gnawing at her sanity. She started to avoid the kitchen, then the living room, and finally her own bedroom. No place in the house felt safe from the whispers that accused her of cruelty, cowardice, and complicity. Donovan's torment. For Donovan, the nights were the worst. He would wake in a cold sweat, the feeling of someone watching him unbearable. His once commanding presence had deteriorated into a shadow of paranoia and fear. The first time he saw Kiara's spectral figure, he convinced himself it was a nightmare. It was in his study, late one night. He was pouring himself another drink when the lights flickered. From the corner of his eye, he saw a figure standing by the window. Slowly, he turned his head, and there she was, Kiara, her face pale, her eyes hollow, staring directly at him. "Donovan," her voice was a chilling whisper, the sound of it slicing through the room like a blade. He stumbled back, dropping his glass. It shattered on the floor, but he didn't notice. His breath came in ragged gasps as he backed away, only for her figure to disappear into the shadows. The sightings grew more frequent. Kiara would appear at the foot of his bed, her unblinking eyes fixed on him. Sometimes she would reach out toward him, her fingers impossibly cold when they brushed against his skin. Each encounter left him more frayed, more broken, until he avoided sleep altogether, terrified of what he might see in the dark. Clara's nightmares. Clara's torment was relentless and deeply personal. Her nights were plagued by vivid, horrifying dreams. In one, she stood in the backyard, staring at the freshly turned soil of Kiara's grave. As she watched, the earth began to shift, cracking open as Kiara's hand reached out, her nails clawing at the dirt. Her lifeless face emerged, her mouth moving but no sound escaping. Clara would wake screaming, drenched in sweat. But the nightmares didn't stop when she was awake. She began seeing Kiara everywhere, in mirrors, in windows, in the reflection of the television screen. Kiara's face was always the same, pale, hollow-eyed, and filled with an unspoken accusation. One afternoon, Clara tried to escape the house, desperate for some relief. She stepped outside and froze. Every neighbor she passed seemed to glance at her with knowing eyes, their gazes heavy with judgment. She could feel the weight of her guilt pressing down on her, even in the open air. She ran back inside, slamming the door behind her, only to find herself face to face with Kiara's ghostly figure in the hallway. "You can't run," Kiara said softly, her voice devoid of emotion. Clara collapsed to the floor, sobbing as Kiara vanished once more. The house turns against them. The house itself seemed to come alive, fueled by Kiara's wrath. The walls groaned, the floors creaked, and the air vibrated with an unnatural energy. Doors slammed shut on their own, trapping the family in rooms for hours. Windows shattered without warning, their shards slicing through the air like knives. The family no longer spoke to one another. Their shared terror had turned them into isolated, paranoid individuals. One night, as the storm raged outside, the family huddled together in the living room. They had lit candles after the power went out, their flickering light casting eerie shadows on the walls. Suddenly, the candles extinguished all at once, plunging the room into darkness. "Who's there?" Donovan demanded, his voice shaking. A soft sobbing filled the room, followed by the sound of footsteps. The family clung to one another, their fear palpable. Then, out of the darkness, Kiara's voice rang out, clear and cold. "You did this to me." The candles reignited, and Kiara stood in the center of the room. Her presence was undeniable, her translucent form glowing faintly in the dim light. Lila screamed, Donovan fell to his knees, and Clara fainted on the spot. The night of reckoning. Kiara's ghost didn't disappear that night. She stayed, watching them with unrelenting intensity. Her voice echoed through the house, recounting their sins in chilling detail. "Lila, you turned a blind eye. Donovan, you let your greed and malice destroy me. Clara, your cruelty broke my spirit." The family begged for forgiveness, but Kiara's expression never changed. Her presence grew stronger with each passing moment, the house trembling under the weight of her fury. Objects flew through the air, smashing against the walls. The floorboards cracked, and the windows shattered, the storm outside seeming to invade the very fabric of the house. By morning, the family was broken. Lila had locked herself in her room, rocking back and forth in silence. Donovan sat in the corner of the living room, muttering incoherently. Clara was nowhere to be found, though faint footprints led from the house to the backyard. Kiara's spirit lingered, her task incomplete. The house, once a place of cruelty and despair, had become her domain, a living nightmare that reflected the sins of those who had wronged her. And she wasn't finished yet. Part 7. The vengeful climax. The house trembled under the weight of its secrets as the storm outside grew fiercer, howling winds rattling the windows and rain pelting against the roof like unrelenting accusations. Within, Donovan sat in his study, the dim glow of a single lamp casting long, menacing shadows. His hands trembled as he poured himself another glass of whiskey, the bottle nearly empty. He hadn't slept in days, haunted by Kiara's spectral figure and the relentless guilt that gnawed at his mind. The air grew colder, and the faint scent of damp earth filled the room. Donovan froze, his grip tightening on the glass. A whisper, soft and venomous, echoed around him. "Donovan," he turned sharply, his eyes darting across the room, but it was empty. The whisper came again, closer this time. You buried me. The lamp flickered, plunging the room into darkness for a brief moment before the light returned, dimmer than before. Donovan's breath quickened as he rose from his chair, clutching the desk for support. His shadow stretched unnaturally on the wall, shifting and twisting as if alive. "Show yourself," he bellowed, his voice cracking. From the corner of the room, a figure emerged. Kiara stood there, her translucent form glowing faintly. Her eyes, hollow and unblinking, bore into Donovan's soul. "You can't hide from what you've done," she said, her voice cold and unwavering. Donovan stumbled backward, knocking over the whiskey bottle. It shattered on the floor, the amber liquid pooling like blood. "It wasn't my fault," he stammered, his voice shaking. "I didn't mean for it to happen." Kiara stepped closer, her presence oppressive. The walls of the study groaned, and the temperature dropped further. "You had a choice," she said, her voice growing louder, more commanding. "And you chose to destroy me, a house of fury." The house itself seemed to respond to Kiara's anger. The walls shuddered, books flew from shelves, and the lamp shattered, plunging the room into darkness. Donovan fell to his knees, clutching his head as Kiara's voice echoed around him, recounting his sins. "Your greed, your cruelty, your silence as I begged for help." Donovan screamed, his voice drowned out by the cacophony of crashing furniture and Kiara's relentless accusations. He crawled toward the door, desperate to escape, but it slammed shut before he could reach it. He turned to face Kiara, tears streaming down his face. "Please, stop," he begged. "I'll do anything." Kiara's expression didn't change. She raised a ghostly hand and the room grew still. "There's nothing you can do," she said. "Your time has come." Clara's collapse. Meanwhile, Clara sat in her bedroom, rocking back and forth on the floor. Her mind was fractured, unable to distinguish reality from nightmare. Kiara's face haunted her, every reflection. Her voice filled her ears even in silence. She clutched a blanket to her chest, muttering Kiara's name over and over. The storm outside intensified, and Clara's door burst open with a deafening crash. She looked up to see Kiara standing in the doorway, her form illuminated by a flash of lightning. Clara screamed, scrambling backward until she hit the wall. "You can't escape me," Kiara said, her voice echoing unnaturally. "You tormented me. You mocked my pain. Now it's your turn to suffer." Clara's screams turned to hysterical sobs as Kiara advanced toward her. The room darkened, and shadows writhed on the walls like living things. Clara curled into a ball, her cries fading into incoherent muttering as her mind shattered under the weight of her guilt and fear. The final reckoning. In the living room, Lila clutched a rosary, whispering frantic prayers. The lights flickered, and the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway. She looked up, her face pale and tear-streaked, as Kiara appeared before her. "Lila," Kiara said, her voice devoid of warmth. "You watched. You let it happen." I couldn't stop it," Lila whispered, trembling. "I didn't know what to do." Kiara's gaze hardened. "You chose to stay silent. You chose your comfort over my life." The rosary slipped from Lila's hands as the room filled with an otherworldly light. Objects flew through the air, crashing into walls and shattering on the floor. Lila fell to her knees, covering her ears as Kiara's voice grew louder, condemning her with every word. The collapse. The storm reached its peak, the winds outside howling like a chorus of the damned. Inside, the house groaned and creaked, as though it were alive and breaking under the weight of its own darkness. Donovan, Clara, and Lila were each trapped in their own personal hells, Kiara's ghost exacting her revenge with merciless precision. In the study, Donovan screamed one last time as the floor beneath him cracked and gave way, swallowing him into the darkness. In her room, Clara collapsed onto the floor, her muttering fading into silence as her mind slipped away entirely. And in the living room, Lila fell unconscious, her body surrounded by the wreckage of the life she had built on lies and cruelty. As the storm subsided, the house stood in eerie silence. The air was heavy with the weight of what had transpired, and the faint scent of damp earth lingered. Kiara's spirit, her vengeance complete, began to fade. Her figure dissolved into the shadows, leaving behind a house filled with broken lives and unanswered questions. The aftermath. By morning, the house was abandoned. The neighbors whispered of the storm and the strange sounds that had come from within, but no one dared to enter. Days later, the authorities arrived, finding the house in ruins and the family missing. The case was never solved, but those who lived nearby swore they could still hear Kiara's voice in the wind, a haunting reminder of the price of cruelty and silence. The lingering presence. Even after the family's disappearance, the house remained a place of dread. Local legends grew around the property, with children daring each other to peek through the broken windows and neighbors avoiding the street entirely after dark. Those who ventured too close often claimed to see fleeting shadows or hear faint sobbing carried on the wind. A year after the events, a group of paranormal investigators entered the house, determined to uncover its secrets. They found the interior in disarray, as though a great force had torn through it. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and their equipment registered unexplained fluctuations. Late in the night, one investigator reported seeing a figure in the hallway, a young woman with hollow eyes and a sorrowful expression. When he called out to her, she vanished, leaving behind only the scent of damp earth. Their recordings captured faint whispers, indistinct but unmistakably accusatory. Why, one voice murmured. You let it happen. The team left the house before dawn, shaken and unwilling to return. Their findings were inconclusive, but their accounts only added to the house's grim reputation. Over time, the property was left to decay, its walls crumbling under the weight of its haunted past. But even as nature reclaimed it, Kiara's presence endured, a testament to the power of a soul wronged. Those who dared speak of the house would often say she's still there, waiting, and perhaps, in the echoes of the wind and the shifting of shadows, she truly was. Part 8. A broken family. By the time the storm subsided and the first light of dawn pierced through the battered windows, the house stood as a hollow shell of its former self. The air was thick with a lingering malice, a testament to the horrors that had unfolded within its walls. Donovan was gone, swallowed by the darkness he had so long ignored. His study lay in ruins, a gaping hole where the floor had once been, as if the house itself had consumed him in retribution. Clara was found in her room, her once vibrant demeanor reduced to a shell of hysteria. She sat on the floor, rocking back and forth, muttering Kiara's name repeatedly. Her eyes were wide and unseeing, fixed on some unseen horror that haunted her mind. Lila found her there, trembling as she reached out to her daughter, but Clara recoiled at her touch, screaming incoherently. The sight of her daughter's fractured state was too much for Lila to bear. Lila's guilt. Lila wandered through the house, her steps hesitant, her face pale and tear-streaked. She clutched a rosary in her trembling hands, the words of her prayer stumbling from her lips. But the weight of her guilt was inescapable. Every corner of the house whispered Kiara's name. Shadows seemed to reach for her, the air thick with accusatory silence. She could feel Kiara's presence, watching, judging. Lila retreated to her room, locking the door as if it could shield her from the spirit that haunted her. She sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the walls, her mind replaying the countless moments of cruelty she had allowed, the pleas for help she had ignored. The rosary slipped from her hands as she broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. By midday, Lila could no longer endure the oppressive atmosphere of the house. Gathering what little strength she had left, she fled. She didn't look back as she stepped out into the daylight, leaving behind the house that had become a tomb for her family's sins. She vanished from the neighborhood, her departure swift and shrouded in whispers. The neighbors speculated about her fate, but none dared to speak of what they suspected had happened within the house. The abandoned home. The house, once filled with laughter and life, now stood abandoned. Its windows were dark, its walls cracked and weathered by time and neglect. Weeds overtook the garden, and the front gate hung on its hinges, creaking eerily in the wind. The neighborhood children dared one another to approach, but even the bravest never ventured inside. Rumors spread quickly. Some claimed to see flickering lights in the windows at night, shadows moving behind the curtains. Others spoke of faint sobbing that carried on the wind, a sorrowful melody that chilled the soul. The story of Kiara's tragic end and the family's mysterious disappearance became a cautionary tale, a legend that grew darker with each retelling. Clara's fate. Clara was taken to a psychiatric facility after being found wandering the neighborhood barefoot and incoherent. Her days were spent in a near catatonic state, her lips moving silently, as if reciting a prayer only she could hear. On rare occasions, she would speak, her voice a trembling whisper she still hear. "She's waiting for me." Doctors could find no explanation for her condition, attributing it to severe psychological trauma. Despite their efforts, Clara never recovered. She remained a prisoner of her own mind, haunted by visions of Kiara and the echoes of her past cruelty. The neighborhood legend. The house became a source of fascination and fear for the neighborhood. It was said that anyone who stepped too close would feel an icy chill, as though the air itself were warning them to stay away. At night, the faint glow of a single light was often seen in the upstairs window, flickering like a dying ember. Those brave enough to approach swore they heard footsteps behind them, though no one was ever there. Over time, the property fell into complete disrepair. The roof sagged, the walls cracked, and vines crept over the facade like fingers reclaiming the structure for nature. Yet the legend of Kiara persisted. Her presence was undeniable to those who believed, her spirit an eternal reminder of the house's dark past. An unsolved mystery. Years later, a team of urban explorers entered the house, drawn by the tales of its haunting. Armed with flashlights and cameras, they ventured inside, their voices hushed as they navigated the crumbling structure. They found the remnants of the family's lives, scattered belongings, overturned furniture, and walls etched with deep scratches as though by unseen hands. In the study, they discovered the gaping hole where Donovan had last been seen. One explorer swore he saw a faint figure at the edge of the shadows, a young woman with sorrowful eyes. When he blinked, she was gone, leaving behind only the faint scent of damp earth. The group's recordings captured faint whispers, indistinct but haunting. Why, a voice murmured. "You let it happen, spooked." The explorers fled before dawn, their footage serving as both proof and a warning. The house, they agreed, was no place for the living. The lingering shadow. As the years passed, the house continued to decay, its walls bowing under the weight of its haunted history. Yet those who walked by swore they could feel its presence, a malevolence that refused to be forgotten. On stormy nights, the faint outline of a figure was said to appear in the upstairs window, watching and waiting. The story of Kiara and her tormentors became a chilling legend, a reminder of the consequences of cruelty and the enduring power of guilt. The house, though abandoned, was never truly empty. And in the shifting shadows and whispers of the wind, Kiara's spirit endured, an unrelenting force bound to the place where her life had been stolen and her justice delivered. The house's final chapter. Decades later, the house was scheduled for demolition. Construction crews arrived early one morning, their heavy machinery prepared to tear down what remained of the dilapidated structure. Yet, as the first wrecking ball swung toward the crumbling facade, the machinery inexplicably stalled. Workers reported their equipment failing, strange noises echoing from within the house, and tools mysteriously disappearing. One worker, braver than the rest, entered the house to investigate. He described the air inside as suffocatingly heavy, the temperature unnaturally cold, despite the summer heat. As he moved through the decaying rooms, he heard faint sobbing. Following the sound, he reached the study and saw Kiara, standing in the center of the room, her sorrowful eyes fixed on him. He fled without a word, refusing to return. After multiple failed attempts to demolish the house, the project was abandoned. The property was fenced off, left to rot further into the earth. The neighborhood grew accustomed to its looming presence, though whispers persisted. On some nights when the wind blew just right, passers-by swore they could hear a faint voice carried through the air. Justice is never forgotten. And so the house remained an eternal monument to pain, guilt, and retribution. Its story etched into the very fabric of its walls and the memories of those who dared to speak of it. Part 9. Justice served. As the years passed, the house's story transformed from a neighborhood tragedy to a legend of justice and retribution. Kiara's spirit, once bound by pain and suffering, had become an eternal force of reckoning, ensuring her tormentors paid for their sins. Her restless presence ensured that none could forget the cruelty that had ended her life. Peace for Kiara, Kiara's spirit found moments of quiet amidst the turmoil. Though she remained tethered to the house, her fury subsided as justice was served. Lila's flight, Clara's descent into madness, and Donovan's disappearance had been inevitable outcomes of their actions. Each of them had faced their reckoning, consumed by the very malice they had inflicted upon her. On nights when the house was silent, Kiara's presence softened. Her translucent figure would sometimes appear by the broken windows, her expression contemplative, rather than vengeful. In those moments, it seemed as though she were looking beyond the confines of her spectral prison, toward a peace she had yet to fully embrace. But her mission was not complete. The house itself remained a testament to what had happened, and she would guard it against those who dared to repeat the sins of the past. A symbol of retribution. The house became an enduring symbol of retribution, a place that mirrored the cruelty that had taken root within its walls. Those who approached felt the weight of its history. The stories told by neighbors were consistent, and overwhelming sense of guilt and sorrow enveloped anyone who drew near, as though the house itself demanded they confront their own misdeeds. Attempts to reclaim or repurpose the property were futile. Developers who sought to demolish it encountered inexplicable failures. Machinery broke down, workers fell ill, and tools vanished without explanation. Each attempt ended with frightened crews abandoning the project, leaving the house to decay further. The property remained untouched, its haunting presence an immovable force in the community. Clara's final days. Clara lived out the rest of her days in a psychiatric institution, her mind fractured beyond repair. She would often sit by the window, staring into the distance and muttering to herself. "She's waiting," Clara would whisper, her voice trembling. "She'll never forgive me." The staff at the facility grew accustomed to her strange behavior, but even they were unnerved by the occasional bursts of screaming. On these nights, Clara would wake in terror, clutching at invisible hands that seemed to close around her throat. The shadows in her room felt alive, flickering and shifting unnaturally. Clara's death was as quiet as her life had been chaotic. She passed in her sleep, her final words a soft plea, "Kiara, I'm sorry." Lila's guilt. Lila vanished after leaving the house, her fate shrouded in mystery. Rumors swirled that she had sought refuge in a distant town, living under an assumed name to escape the stigma of her family's downfall. Others believed she had succumbed to her guilt, unable to find solace after abandoning her daughter and her home. Some claimed to have seen her wandering near the house late at night, her face gaunt and her eyes hollow. Whether this was true or merely a story born of the neighborhood's fascination with the tragedy, no one could say for certain. What was undeniable was that Lila's departure left her as much a ghost as Kiara, haunted by the past she could never escape. The Eternal Watcher. Kiara's spirit remained, her presence an unwavering force within the house. Those brave enough to peer through its broken windows at night often reported seeing her figure, standing motionless in the upstairs room where she had once slept. Her sorrowful gaze seemed to pierce through the darkness, a silent reminder of the justice she had delivered. Visitors spoke of hearing faint whispers carried on the wind. "Remember," the voice would say, soft yet chilling. On rare occasions, those who entered the house claimed to feel an icy hand brush against their shoulder or see a fleeting shadow pass through the halls. Each encounter left them shaken, convinced they had been in the presence of something otherworldly. A lesson unforgotten. The story of Kiara and her tormentors became a cautionary tale, passed down through generations in the neighborhood. Parents told their children about the dangers of unchecked cruelty, using the house as a living metaphor. "The house remembers," they would say. And so does she. Over time, the house's decay became symbolic of the decay of the human spirit when malice is allowed to thrive. It stood as both a warning and a reminder that justice, though delayed, is inevitable. The house was more than bricks and mortar. It was a monument to Kiara's resilience and the enduring power of truth. The final silence. Decades after the events that sealed the house's fate, a storm rolled through the neighborhood. The winds howled, and the rain fell in torrents, much like the night Kiara's life had been stolen. By morning, the house had collapsed in on itself, reduced to rubble by the weight of time and weather. The land where it stood became an empty lot, but its presence lingered. Neighbors claimed they could still feel its oppressive energy, as though the ground itself bore the memory of what had occurred. Despite offers to rebuild, no one dared disturb the site. It remained untouched, a scar on the landscape and a testament to the consequences of cruelty. And though the house was gone, Kiara's spirit had found peace at last. With her justice served and her tormentors punished, she faded from the earthly plane, leaving behind a legacy of strength and retribution. But for those who remembered her story, the lesson endured: cruelty carries a price, and justice, no matter how long delayed, will always find its way.